So, I don't do future studies. I'm not a futurist. What I'm expert at is, in different ways, extreme problem solving. I like fixing stuff. And when I look at fixing stuff, I mean really hard, impossible, big things. And at the end, I'll talk about sort of pretty much if you don't like the future, you can change it. I'll be sharing with you almost a tool set and a way of looking at the world that looks at scaling. But when I look at scaling, just by way of context, this is an interesting picture. So this was a picture created in Holland back in Delft 350 years ago. 350 years ago, there was a crazy Dutch guy. And many of you are crazy and Dutch. So one of these crazy Dutch people basically spent a decade of his life writing papers about how he saw small things moving around in water. And in this case, we can kind of guess what this stuff is. Well, he was obviously stark raving bonkers, because if we looked at this stuff and you try to see it with the naked eye, you can't see anything small. Well, it turns out, so Sir Isaac Newton was one of the members of the Royal Society. So this Royal Society, this group of eminent scientists from the UK, came over to visit this crazy man in his laboratory in Delft. And when they got there, they realized that he had invented the microscope. The small things had always existed, and yet human beings did not have the eyes nor the lens to see them. That was a fundamental, completely black swan change as to how human beings looked at the world. Well, what I've been looking at is, can we have a new lens, a new microscope on human behavior, so that we can have a way of understanding better what is going on, to be able to predict what is likely to happen next, and then, for the really cool stuff, how can you design different futures? So you can design out the bad stuff and design in the good stuff. I just published a book, I published it very recently, on scaling. And for me, just as a definition of scaling, this is sort of part of a body of work that I'm doing. I've looked at scaling as being, how do you produce outsized results, very large results, not just sort of growth for a business, but also sort of changes in society, through small, smart moves, aided by good fortune. And what I'm doing is I'm going to share two little case studies with you about how things scale. So this is the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I'm not going to tell the whole story of the Berlin Wall. I tend to cry when I tell the story of the Berlin Wall. Very emotional. I live in Berlin now. But the Berlin Wall was amazing. We just heard the Rand Corporation with 200 Russian people. They completely missed it. Everybody totally missed the end of communism. How can you miss the end of, I mean, it's sort of a fundamental transition. And yet, when we actually look at what happened for the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was very weird. So in '88, you had Polish strikes. So because the Politburo in Poland realized that Russia was not going to send in tanks, they allowed solidarity, they relieved pressure on the system, they allowed solidarity to fight in elections. Solidarity won the votes that they had in April of '89. Hungary, thank you Tomas, opened the borders, not necessarily him, but his compatriots opened the borders because they said, look, if Russian tanks are going to close us down, we're just going to do what we like. And now this meant that if you could get to Hungary, you could get out. The thing is, as an East German, you needed a passport and a visa, and that was basically impossible. So there was pressure building up through the summer of '89. Now, by the way, if you read the papers and the reports and the forecasts, nobody said communism is going to end. It just didn't say that. But on November the 9th, there were 4 people. So there was, in fact, there was a big protest. There were 500,000 people on the streets of Berlin on the 4th of November. Pretty much, it was a group of actors called the Berlin Ensemble who had managed to organize a protest and just kind of scaled up to 500,000. But nobody was protesting for freedom, and nobody was protesting for the wall to come down. No reunification. People wanted to have the right to vote. They wanted to have the right to be able to speak. On the morning of November the 9th, 4 very junior people in the army made a little sort of a document to saying, we can make travel be less of an issue by allowing people to travel, make it easier. And not only that, if you want to be a refugee, but if you would like to just pop over to the West, get some stuff, and then come back again, you should be able to do that too. This was a draft document that got handed around to Egon Kranz, the temporary head of the state. This draft document hadn't been reviewed by the Politburo. There's a press conference that takes place at 6 p.m. This is the first live broadcast from East Germany. And this guy, Gunther Schabowski, who was the Communist Party representative, he did his presentation and he said, pretty much, East Germans are able to travel immediately. But now the small thing is going to take place. When the Associated Press put out the press release at 5 minutes past 7, the headline was, East German borders now open. Now there was a whole bunch of detail to this, but the headline said, borders now open. This meant that the TV news picked up borders now open. This meant that people that could listen to West German news from the east, which many of them could, started going to the border checkpoints. You had border checkpoint guards thinking, we haven't heard this news. It was meant to be under embargo until 4 a.m. the next morning. Just at 10:30, when the East German government decided to pretty much put their own official release out to say it's not true, you had a West German journalist standing at Checkpoint Charlie saying, here are the people going through. Within 24 hours, the Berlin Wall came down and nobody knew what the hell was going on. Small moves. But now here's another story. Now, I never cried this story. What is the fastest selling book of all history? Harry Potter? 50 Shades of Grey sold 100 million copies. It's a billion-dollar business in 2 years, and it's a terrible book. The reason why it's successful has nothing to do with the content. Because if you look at sex and pornographic books, because there are many of those in history, nobody came even fractionally close to 100 million. Previous to that, the best-selling book had been 1 million. So it has nothing to do with sex, and it has nothing to do with BDSM. And it certainly hasn't to do with bad literature, because it's terrible, it's unreasonable. But what was interesting when I began to look at this thing is that 50 Shades of Grey was done deliberately to scale. For example, she did fan fiction, so she took Twilight and she took the characters of Twilight. It's very lazy fiction style. And she gave them an alternate universe of, let's say, an office romance with whips and chains. You can laugh at these things if you want. But what happened with that is because it was Twilight, many people have read Twilight stuff. So because it's Twilight, 1% of Twilight readers will read anything. She put it on the crowd, so she used the power of the crowd. We talked about open sourcing the future. Well, you can open source these type of books. So she had 37,000 reviewing comments. The title of the book was chosen by her fans. Originally, it was called Master of the Universe, but there was one thing in chapter 16, and I haven't read that far, but I had to skip ahead, where he says, don't touch me because I'm 50 shades of fucked up. Well, this meant that right now, then, that sort of, because the fans loved it so much, she repeated it, and this became the book title. She used hubs and amplifiers, so methods of a network where she was able to get the book into the hands of the Devalicious Mom's website in Connecticut. That got her into the publishing scene in New York. That got her a 7-figure book deal within a month and a half. And as soon as Random House picked it up, this meant that the New York Times could write about it. Because the New York Times says, hey, it's sex, because that helps them sell advertising space for cars and insurance products. So this meant that the New York Times covered it, which gives CNN, Entertainment Today. In the first 3 months alone, it sold 30 million copies. The reason why I'm sharing this thing is that it turned out that she did that stuff on purpose. She basically scaled these things. And what I've been looking at is, can we find some underlying concepts and methods, a different sort of microscope, a different lens on the world? And once we have this, can we understand what's going on with a different set of tools? And then can we apply it? So what I've been looking at, and this has already been highlighted through some of these things, I found that there are 3 important big concepts that I've been looking at as to just new ways of looking at things. One is called emergence. Now this can be called complexity, but complexity sounds hard. And there's simple complexity, and then there's easy complexity. I like the easy ones. So complex systems pretty much can be defined as being, let's call us people. There are people with a state memory. So we knew where we were a second ago, so we're not random. We're interacting, we're giving off signals and picking up signals, and there's a passage over time. What this means is that you end up with potentially very, very complex outcomes out of very simple systems. This room is complex, but what's really, really, really weird is you're all doing exactly the same thing. And yet if you looked at all of our backgrounds, ethnicities, genders, academic things, the actual mathematical odds of us doing exactly the same thing at the same time is basically 0. And yet we find in human systems and other systems we have these patterns of behaviors occurring. The reason why they merge is the use of rules. We have simple rules, such as follow what your peers are doing, keep doing what you're doing until there's a compelling reason to change. These basic rules can explain about 60% plus of human behavior. This becomes very, very handy when you're trying to scale things. Because it turns out if people follow other people, therefore, if we find out who they follow, we can pretty much put change, like we can have ignition in places where they get followed, and this stuff can get picked up, and it can spread very rapidly. But then on top of emergence, we've been looking at networks, the science of networks. And with networks, you have a network structure, so you have your social graph, who you connected to, but it's interesting to see how you can activate networks. It's also interesting that certain structures begin to exist within networks. there's a type of network dynamic called a long jump network, where if you want to get something done, if you're in a very dense network of people that all went to school with each other, live in the same place, it's very hard to get stuff out of that network. But if you're in more diverse networks, and hopefully this community here will become very diverse with people from different countries, backgrounds, it means that if you want something, you can ask the network, and the network will hop and jump great distances. I'm going to be sharing sort of a little bit of stories. I won't have time for the end, but I worked on a civilian military intelligence network across Libya. This meant that civilians were reporting to their local doctors where they saw Libyan tanks. This, by the way, is when we get into the world of the crazy, real stuff. Spotting Libyan tanks, they would call their local doctor. The doctor would call it in through a network called Global Relief Libya to a guy in Benghazi, who would turn this Arabic stuff into English, put a timestamp on it, and work out a Google map. But now this meant that before the UN had a no-fly zone across Libya, we were getting reports about where tanks were. And our goal was to stop civilians getting killed. Well, the use of long jump networks were, one of the people in my network is in the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He knows that some of the stuff that I do might sound crazy, but it's actually quite truthful. And within 1 hour of me saying, hey, I've got some information about some tanks that you might be interested in, then we're talking to Dutch military intelligence to coordinate military strikes. To the extent that the first military strike in the NATO bombing that was done by France was not organized by the military. This was actually information sent by a group of civilians to Sarkozy's office to have the first military strike done. This is what individuals can do with a new tool set to change the world if you don't like the outcome. The power of networks is a long jump as an example. Then I've also been looking at waves. Waves then is almost like there's a sort of a surplus of energy in most systems. And what you can do is you can tap into these waves. You can sometimes unleash a wave, as was done across the Arab Spring. You can catch waves that already exist, as 50 Shades did with the ebook. So I'm not sure if you will admit to reading 50 Shades, but about 50% of 50 Shades of Grey has been bought on ebooks, and she took advantage of that wave. But see, these waves gives you different ways of building up to crescendos and synchronizing. Well, what I've done then is that I looked at these concepts, and trying to make things more practical, I translated them into frames, ways of looking at problems in different ways. So this is a little bit of an eye chart, and so I'm not going to sort of go into this. But then you would, let's say, take the principle of emergence, and then you might take crowd power. Take advantage of the power of large numbers of people to go do stuff, because that allows you to play with abundance and a bunch of different characteristics. Or you might take a network effect, infectious ideas. So in 50 Shades of Grey, the cover of 50 Shades of Grey did not have pictures of boobies and private parts. Now, previous to that, most pornographic novels had pictures of boobies and private parts. But the 50 Shades of Grey cover was designed to be infectious. It was a black cover with a tie. You didn't know what it was, and it meant that they could put 50 Shades of Grey everywhere, and nobody had a clue what they were buying until they'd bought it. Tactics. Now, I'm going to just give you some sort of two examples about practical applications, because for me, if you don't like the future that might happen, it is possible as an activist, as an individual or a group, to find ways of changing it. So this is Zimbabwe in 2008, and Robert Mugabe lost the stolen election by 50.4%. This was me and my buddy Arthur Mutambara. This isn't actually him. So Arthur Mutambara became the Deputy Prime Minister of Zimbabwe. And pretty much the challenge was then, if there is to be an election, the election will be stolen. You've got 5 weeks, you have no money, and you can't tell anybody what you're doing because you get arrested and killed for this stuff. Can you find a way of defeating a dictator in a corrupt election? So, of course. Never been done before, but sure, why not? And so I only asked this guy about 10 questions. I knew nothing about Zimbabwe, had no internet access, and I'd only had 2 hours of sleep because I've been partying until 3 in the morning. But in just asking him a few questions, the key was how was the elections going to be stolen? And then given that pretty much you bribed the election officials, it meant that there was going to be an honest vote because they didn't have to cheat because they knew what the result was. Well, we ended up inventing crowdsourced election monitoring. 1,000 people with camera phones taking pictures of the election results. This would be like a results table. So within 10 hours, without anybody knowing what was going on, we changed the outcome of an entire country. And when I say we, there were 5 people. By following these different rules. Doing biology without a microscope is just guesswork. As soon as you have a microscope, it might be a little bit hard or tricky, but it's not impossible. I'll give you one last example. In the Libyan war, it was public knowledge that Goldman Sachs had lost $1 billion of Gaddafi money during the war. That was leaked to the world press through an NGO called Global Witness. I was the leak. By the way, I've outed myself to make my life more safe. I did some fun spy stuff. The idea was that, so the Libyan rebels had run out of money during the Libyan war. They were trying to borrow 200 million euros from the Italian bank Unicredit, and Unicredit said, no, you're rebels, I can't give you security, not a chance in hell. So in looking at the system, we knew that it wasn't naturally going to happen, so this is me and my friend. So we decided this is a very easy system to fix. How do we convince a small number of people, namely the bankers in in Italy, to change their mind? Well, bad people hide in the dark, so let there be light. So wouldn't it be nice if there was a leak? The bankers don't give a shit about the money. The money's totally irrelevant. They just don't want anybody looking. So the central bank had been blown up. There were pictures in the New York Times. Somebody went into the bank and got me this, which was the management accounts, $52 billion under management for the Libyan Investment Authority. I got this emailed to me on Thursday morning. Using the power of long jump networks, one of my friends runs Global Witness. I gave her a call. Hello, I've got something that I think you'll find very interesting. On the Tuesday it goes out, it hits 4 global headline news. The day after it goes into 200 newspapers around the world because it had every single stock, bond, trade, company that the Libyans owned. And 1 week afterwards, the Italians gave them a 200 million euro unsecured loan. The reason why I'm sharing this, and I talk about scaling, when you're looking at the future, you can sort of sit on your hands, almost sort of hope that things happen, don't happen. What I'm sharing with you is almost like the back end of this, the future in 50 years and how do we get there. There are tool sets that are methods that are new, that are developing, that I'm happy to share with you now as an opportunity, but we can use these things to actually change the outcome for the future for better, or stop some of the outcomes of the future that will make things worse. And with that, thank you very much. Thank you.